Good evening. Tonight, we descend into the most treacherous throne room in human history, the Byzantine imperial palace, where the weight of a purple robe could crush a man's soul, and the kiss of a trusted advisor might be the last thing an emperor ever feels. For over 1,000 years, from the founding of Constantinople in 330 AD to its fall in 1453, the Byzantine Empire stood as the last flickering flame of Rome. But its emperors lived lives of such paranoia, brutality, and constant terror that death often came as a mercy. This is the story of men who claimed to rule by divine right but slept with daggers under their pillows, who commanded armies that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates but couldn't trust their own children, and who wore crowns that were less symbols of power than targets painted on their foreheads. Before we descend into the marble halls and blood-soaked chambers of the Byzantine court, drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's see how far the empire stretches, and whether you're brave enough to witness this tale in the darkness of night or the safety of daylight. The purple was never just a color in Byzantium. It was a curse disguised as a blessing, a death sentence written in silk and gold thread. To understand the sheer terror of wearing the Byzantine crown, you must first grasp the suffocating weight of its traditions. The emperor was not merely a man, he was the living representative of Christ. On earth, the Basileus Autocrator, the God-appointed ruler whose every breath was supposedly guided by divine will. Yet this divine mandate came with a price so steep that many emperors would have gladly traded their throne for a beggar's bowl and the freedom to sleep without fear. The very architecture of the great palace spoke of this paranoia. Built like a maze of interconnected chambers, secret passages, and hidden stairways, it was designed not for comfort, but for survival. An emperor might have 50 different routes to his bedroom, each one guarded by different units of soldiers whose loyalty was bought with gold that could be withdrawn at any moment. The famous Purple Chamber, where legitimate heirs were born, was surrounded by walls so thick that screams couldn't penetrate them, and screams were common in the imperial quarters. Every morning, a Byzantine emperor woke not to the gentle rays of dawn filtering through silk curtains, but to the cold reality that he had survived another night. His first act was not prayer or breakfast, but a careful inventory of who was still alive, who had gained power overnight, and who might be sharpening a knife with his name on it. The emperor's daily routine was a choreographed dance of survival, each step calculated to project strength while minimizing vulnerability. The sacred morning ritual of the imperial levee was theater of the most deadly kind. Courtiers, generals, bishops, and foreign ambassadors would gather in the hall of the 19 couches, each man weighing his words like a jeweler examining precious stones. One misplaced compliment, one insufficient bow, one glance held too long could be interpreted as treason. The emperor, resplendent in robes that cost more than entire cities, would receive these morning supplicants while mentally cataloguing which ones might be plotting his demise. The irony was suffocating. The most powerful man in the world was simultaneously the most vulnerable, surrounded by hundreds of people who smiled while calculating the precise angle needed to slip a blade between his ribs. Byzantine court protocol was not mere ceremony. It was a sophisticated system of psychological warfare designed to keep everyone, including the emperor, in a constant state of controlled terror. The elaborate proskynesis, the ritual of prostration before the throne, served multiple purposes. It humiliated potential rivals, created artificial distance between the emperor and his subjects, And most importantly, it forced visitors to assume a position from which they couldn't easily launch an attack. Every blow was a small victory for imperial survival. But the emperor's greatest enemies were not always found among the prostrating masses in his throne room. More often, they shared his blood, his name, and his dinner table. The Byzantine imperial family was a viper's nest where brothers murdered brothers, sons poisoned fathers, and mothers strangled their own children to prevent civil war. The imperial succession was not governed by primogeniture, but by a deadly combination of military backing, popular support, and sheer ruthlessness. This meant that every male member of the imperial family was simultaneously a potential heir and a walking target. Consider the reign of Constantine VI, who ruled from 780 to 797 AD. His own mother, Irene, had him blinded with such brutality that he died from his wounds, all because she refused to surrender power when he came of age. The instruments used for imperial blinding were kept in a special chamber of the palace, maintained by eunuchs whose own mutilation made them supposedly trustworthy servants. The irony was exquisite. Men who had been deliberately broken were the only ones considered safe enough to break others. The practice of blinding deserves particular attention because it reveals the Byzantine mind's capacity for creative cruelty. Death was sometimes too merciful to final. A dead rival could become a martyr, a rallying point for rebellion. But a blind man was living proof of the emperor's power, a walking reminder that challenging the throne led not to glorious death, but to stumbling, helpless existence. The blinding of emperors was carried out with heated irons, molten lead, or specially designed instruments that could remove sight while keeping the victim alive for decades of public humiliation. Emperor Romanos for Diogenes learned this lesson in the most personal way possible. After his catastrophic defeat by the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, he returned to Constantinople to find that his stepson, Michael VII, had already claimed the throne. Romanos was captured, deposed, and blinded so viciously that he died within days, his crime, losing a battle while trying to defend the empire. His punishment, having his eyes burned out with red-hot irons by the very people he had sworn to protect. The eunuchs of the Byzantine court formed a parallel power structure that was simultaneously indispensable and terrifying. Castrated as children, these men could never father dynasties or claim the throne themselves, which theoretically made them perfect servants. In practice, they became the ultimate kingmakers, wielding influence that often exceeded that of the emperor himself. The Grand Legathit, the Parakoimenos, the Protovestiarios. These titles might sound quaint to modern ears, but they represented positions of such power that their holders could topple dynasties with a whispered word in the right ear. The Eunuch Basilikapenos, known as the Parakoimonos, virtually ruled the empire during the reigns of Constantine VII and Romanos II. He accumulated such wealth and influence that he could have bought and sold entire provinces. Yet even he lived in constant fear, because eunuch or not, proximity to power made him a target. When John Simisk seized the throne in 969 AD, one of his first acts was to exile Basil, stripping him of his titles and wealth in a single decree. The man who had once decided the fate of generals and bishops died in obscurity, a reminder that in Byzantium there was no such thing as permanent safety. Religious disputes in the Byzantine Empire were not matters of theological debate, but life and death struggles that could literally burn emperors alive. The iconoclastic controversy which raged from 726 to 843 AD, was ostensibly about whether Christians should venerate religious images. In reality, it was a power struggle between the emperor, the army, the church, and the people, with each side using theology as a weapon to destroy their enemies. Emperor Leo III initiated the first period of iconoclasm in 726 AD, ordering the destruction of religious images throughout the empire. His motives were complex. Military defeats had led some to believe that God was punishing the empire for idolatry, while others saw iconoclasm as a way to reduce the power of monasteries that had grown too wealthy and influential. The result was civil war in all but name, with iconoclast emperors facing rebellions, assassination attempts, and excommunication. The iconoclast emperor Constantine V, known to his enemies as Copronymus, literally named after dung, faced such hatred from the image-venerating population that his very name became a curse. Monks were tortured, exiled, and executed for refusing to abandon their icons. The emperor himself lived in constant fear of divine retribution, reportedly suffering from nightmares where angry saints appeared to condemn him. When he died in 775 AD, his enemies claimed that his corpse immediately began to rot and stink, proof of God's displeasure. But religious orthodoxy was no guarantee of safety either. Emperor Michael III, despite being a defender of icon veneration, was murdered by his own best friend and co-emperor, Basil the Macedonian. In 867 AD, the assassination took place during a drinking party in the palace, where Basil and his conspirators fell upon Michael with swords, hacking him to death while he was too drunk to defend himself. Basil then calmly announced that he was now the sole emperor, and anyone who objected could join Michael in the afterlife. The military was both the emperor's greatest asset and his most dangerous threat. Byzantine emperors were expected to lead their armies personally, riding at the head of cavalry charges and exposing themselves to the arrows of enemy archers. This expectation created a deadly paradox. An emperor who stayed in Constantinople was seen as weak and cowardly, but an emperor who left the capital gave his enemies the perfect opportunity to stage a coup. Emperor Valens learned this lesson fatally at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. Determined to prove his military prowess against the Goths, he refused to wait for reinforcements and instead led his army into what became one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. Valens himself was killed in the battle, his body so mutilated that it was never properly identified. His Gothic enemies reportedly used his skull as a drinking cup, the ultimate humiliation for a man who had claimed divine mandate to rule. The logistics of imperial campaigns created additional vulnerabilities. An emperor on campaign was separated from his power base, reliant on the loyalty of men who might decide that a new emperor would be more generous with promotions and land grants. The imperial tent became a mobile target, surrounded by soldiers whose loyalty was bought, with promises that could be broken by anyone with a stronger sword arm. Emperor Nikephoros. I discovered the price of military failure in the most brutal way possible when he was killed fighting the Bulgars in 811 AD. The Bulgarian Khan, Krum, had Nikephoros' skull turned into a drinking cup lined with silver, using it to toast his victories over the empire. The emperor's head, once crowned with the sacred diadem, became a barbarian's goblet, a fate that haunted the nightmares of every subsequent emperor who dared to take the field. The common people of Constantinople were no less dangerous than the aristocracy perhaps more so because their loyalty could not be bought with titles or land grants. The circus factions, the Blues and Greens, were ostensibly sports clubs centered around chariot racing, but they functioned as political parties, religious movements, and paramilitary organizations rolled into one. An emperor who lost the support of the factions might find himself facing a revolution that could burn the capital to the ground. The Nika revolt of 532 AE nearly ended the reign of Justinian I before it had properly begun. What started as a dispute over chariot racing escalated into a full-scale rebellion that left much of Constantinople in flames. The rebels proclaimed a new emperor, Hypatius, and marched on the great palace with the intention of dragging Justinian from his throne and tearing him apart in the hippodrome. Only the intervention of his wife Theodora, who famously declared that purple makes a fine shroud, and the ruthless action of generals Belisarius and Mundus, who massacred 30,000 civilians in the hippodrome, saved Justinian's life and throne. The emperor's relationship with the Orthodox Church was a constant source of tension and danger. While the emperor was theoretically God's representative on earth, the Patriarch of Constantinople and the various bishops throughout the empire had their own sources of power and legitimacy. An emperor who found himself at odds with the Church faced not just political opposition but spiritual warfare, with monks and priests declaring him anathema and encouraging rebellion as a religious duty. Emperor Anastasius I spent much of his reign fighting religious rebellions sparked by his support for Monophysite Christianity, which was considered heretical by the Orthodox establishment. Riots broke out across the empire, with Orthodox mobs attacking government buildings and imperial officials. The emperor's palace was besieged by angry crowds chanting religious slogans and demanding his abdication. Anastasius survived, but only by making increasingly desperate concessions to Orthodox leaders, effectively surrendering much of his authority to men who claimed to speak for God. The imperial bureaucracy, for all its supposed efficiency, was itself a source of constant threat. The legathets, domesticos, and other high officials formed a complex web of competing interests and personal ambitions. Each man in the hierarchy was simultaneously indispensable and replaceable, loyal and treacherous, competent and corrupt. An emperor had to navigate this labyrinth daily, knowing that any decision could create new enemies or strengthen existing ones. The position of Logothia of the Dramas, essentially the empire's foreign minister and intelligence chief, was particularly dangerous to hold and dangerous to oppose. This official controlled the empire's spy networks, diplomatic correspondence, and much of its information flow. A competent Logothet could make or break an emperor's reign, but a Logothet who became too powerful was himself a threat to imperial authority. The position was like holding a loaded crossbow pointed at the emperor's heart, useful for defense, but potentially fatal if it accidentally discharged. Poison was the weapon of choice for Byzantine assassins, partly because it could be administered discreetly and partly because it allowed for plausible deniability. The imperial kitchens employed food tasters whose job was to die in place of the emperor, but even this precaution was imperfect. Slow-acting poisons could kill a taster days after the emperor had consumed the same meal. Contact poisons could be applied to clothing, jewelry, or even the imperial crown itself. Emperor John Octava Palaiologos purportedly lived in such fear of poison that he would only eat food prepared by his own hands, using ingredients he had personally selected and inspected. His paranoia was not unfounded. His own brothers were actively plotting against him, and foreign powers were offering substantial rewards for his death. The emperor's meals became elaborate rituals of suspicion, with every dish examined, every cup inspected, every servant watched for signs of guilt or nervousness. The famous case of Emperor Romanos III Argyros illustrates the deadly sophistication of Byzantine poisoning techniques. In 1034 AD, Romanos was found dead in his bath, officially from drowning. But contemporary sources strongly suggest he was poisoned by his wife Zoe, who wanted to marry her lover Michael the Paphlagonian. The poison was reportedly administered through a perfumed oil used in the emperor's bath, a method that left no obvious traces and could be explained as an accidental drowning. Zoe became empress for the second time, and Michael became emperor, proving that sometimes the most dangerous enemy shared the imperial bed. Foreign enemies added another layer of terror to imperial existence. The Byzantine Empire was surrounded by hostile powers, Arabs to the south and east, Bulgars and later Ottomans to the north and west, Italian Norman adventurers, and eventually Crusaders who claimed to be allies but often proved more dangerous than declared enemies. An emperor's foreign policy decisions could literally determine whether he died in his bed or on a battlefield with enemy arrows in his back. The relationship with the Crusaders was particularly treacherous because it required the emperor to welcome heavily armed foreigners into his territory while pretending to share their religious motivations. Emperor Alexios Komnenos spent much of his reign trying to use the Crusaders to reclaim lost territories while preventing them from conquering Constantinople itself. The delicate balance required constant vigilance and diplomatic skill that would have challenged Machiavelli himself. When the Fourth Crusade ultimately sacked Constantinople in 1204 AD, Emperor Alexios IV Angelos learned that even fellow Christians could be more brutal than Muslim enemies. The Crusaders, supposedly fighting for the glory of God, subjected the city to 3 days of rape, murder, and pillage that shocked even medieval chroniclers accustomed to warfare's brutalities. IV was strangled by his own courtiers, who blamed him for inviting the Crusaders into the empire. His death was almost merciful compared to the fate of ordinary citizens, who were butchered in churches while praying for divine protection. The economic pressures of maintaining the empire created additional sources of danger for emperors. The Byzantine tax system was notoriously complex and corrupt, with revenue collection often dependent on officials whose loyalty was questionable at best. An emperor who raised taxes to high-faced rebellion from his subjects, but an emperor who lowered taxes to much-faced rebellion from his soldiers, who expected regular pay and generous bonuses. The debasement of the solidus, the gold coin, that had been the backbone of Byzantine currency for centuries, became a desperate measure employed by emperors who needed immediate funds for military campaigns or bribes to potential allies. But currency debasement was a double-edged sword that could destroy an emperor's credibility and trigger economic collapse. Emperor Michael VII Doukas was nicknamed -1/4 because he reduced the gold content of coins by 20%, a decision that contributed to his eventual overthrow in 1078. The imperial regalia itself was a source of danger. The crown was so heavy that it required special neck muscles developed through years of training. The purple robes were so elaborate that they restricted movement and made quick escapes impossible. The ceremonial jewelry was so ostentatious that it advertised the emperor's wealth to every potential robber or revolutionary in the empire. An emperor dressed for state occasions was essentially wearing a target that could be seen from across the Bosphorus. The famous incident of Emperor John II Komnenos illustrates how even the imperial regalia could become a death trap. In 1143 AD, while on campaign in Cilicia, John was wounded by a poisoned arrow while hunting. The wound might have been survivable, but the emperor's elaborate hunting costume prevented his physicians from treating it properly. He died of infection while his courtiers debated whether removing the imperial garments would constitute lèse majesté. The man who had successfully defended the empire against numerous enemies was killed by his own clothing. Sleep itself became a battlefield for Byzantine emperors. The imperial bedchamber was supposed to be the most secure room in the palace, but it was also the most isolated, the place where an emperor was most vulnerable to attack. The bed was checked nightly for hidden weapons, poisonous insects, or booby traps. The pillows were inspected for needles or other sharp objects. Even the chamber pot was examined to ensure that no assassin had concealed himself in the garderobe. Emperor Constantine VIII reportedly never slept in the same bed twice, maintaining a dozen different bedchambers and choosing randomly each night to confuse potential assassins. His paranoia extended to his dreams, which he had interpreted by professional soothsayers who might themselves be spies or assassins. The emperor's sleep became a form of strategic planning, with every position and every precaution calculated. To maximize survival chances, the imperial harem, when it existed, presented its own unique dangers. Concubines, eunuchs, and female servants formed complex networks of loyalty and betrayal that could destroy an emperor as easily as they could pleasure him. The competition for imperial favor among concubines was literally cutthroat, with poisoning, strangling, and accidents regularly reducing the population of the women's quarters. Empress Zoe, Carbonopsina, the mistress-turned-wife of Emperor Leo VI, demonstrated how dangerous imperial women could be when they felt threatened. She reportedly ordered the assassination of several rivals and may have been involved in the mysterious death of Leo's previous wife, Eudokia Baiona. When Leo died in 912 AD, Zoe became regent for their young son Constantine VII, wielding imperial power while surrounded by enemies who questioned her legitimacy and plotted her downfall. The training of future emperors was itself a form of torture disguised as education. Young princes were taught to trust no one completely, to interpret every gesture and word for hidden meanings, and to assume that anyone who approached them wanted something that could only be obtained through betrayal. This education in paranoia was necessary for survival, but often produced emperors who were psychologically damaged, unable to form genuine relationships or make decisions based on anything other than fear. The case of Emperor Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, illustrates both the effectiveness and the cost of this paranoid education. Basil trusted no one, never married, never had children, and spent his entire adult life on military campaigns, where he felt safer surrounded by enemies who were honest about their intentions than by courtiers who smiled while plotting his destruction. He died in 1025 AD as one of the most successful emperors in Byzantine history, but also as a man who had never experienced genuine human connection. The imperial coronation ceremony was designed to be the most glorious moment in an emperor's life, but it was also often the most dangerous. The ceremony required the emperor to appear in public, surrounded by crowds whose loyalty was uncertain and whose enthusiasm could turn to violence without warning. The weight of the crown, the complexity of the rituals, and the pressure of performing before thousands of observers combined to create an ordeal that some emperors did not survive. Emperor Michael V. Caliphates learned this lesson during his attempted coronation in 1042 AD. The ceremony was interrupted by riots as the people of Constantinople demonstrated their loyalty to the previous empress, Zoe, whom Michael had attempted to exile. The would-be emperor was dragged from the altar, blinded and castrated while still wearing his coronation robes. The purple silk was soaked with blood before he had officially become emperor. The diplomatic receptions, held in the Great Palace, were elaborate psychological warfare designed to intimidate foreign ambassadors while demonstrating imperial power. But they also created opportunities for assassination, espionage, and humiliation that could destroy an emperor's reputation. Every foreign envoy was a potential spy, every gift a potential weapon, every ceremony a potential trap. The famous reception of the Russian princess Olga by Emperor Constantine VII in 957 AD demonstrates the complex dangers of imperial diplomacy. Olga was officially a potential ally and trading partner, but she was also a powerful ruler in her own right with her own agenda. The emperor had to honor her appropriately without giving her opportunities to gather intelligence or form alliances with his enemies. The reception was choreographed down to the smallest detail, with every bow, every word, and every gesture calculated to maintain Byzantine superiority while avoiding offense that could trigger war. The imperial library and scriptorium were supposed to be refuges of learning and contemplation, but even these scholarly retreats were contaminated by the paranoia that pervaded palace life. Scribes who copied official documents knew state secrets that could be worth enormous sums to foreign powers. Scholars who had access to historical records could use their knowledge to question the legitimacy of the current dynasty. Even the books themselves could be dangerous. A treatise on military tactics in the wrong hands could doom a campaign, while a theological work could spark religious rebellion. Emperor Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitos, himself a scholar and author, was reportedly so paranoid about the security of his writings that he employed multiple scribes to copy different sections of his works, ensuring that no single person could possess complete copies of his most sensitive documents. His masterwork, the De Administrando Imperio, was written as a guide for his son, but was also a catalogue of state secrets that could have destroyed the empire. If it had fallen into enemy hands, the imperial medical staff presented another source of potential danger. Palace physicians had intimate access to the emperor's body and detailed knowledge of his health problems, information that could be invaluable to assassins or enemies seeking to exploit weakness. The medicines themselves could be turned into poisons with small modifications, and the trust required for medical treatment made emperors vulnerable to betrayal by the very people charged with keeping them alive. The death of Emperor John II Komnenos provides a perfect example of how medical care could become a form of assassination. When John was wounded by a poisoned arrow during a hunting expedition in 1143 AD, his physicians reportedly debated whether to amputate his infected hand. Some historians suggest that the delay in treatment was deliberate, orchestrated by courtiers who wanted John's son Manuel to inherit the throne rather than his designated heir. Isaac, the emperor, died of gangrene, while his doctors argued about theology and imperial protocol. The seasonal migrations of the imperial court created additional security challenges. During the hot summer months, the emperor and his entourage would often move to cooler locations outside Constantinople. But these journeys exposed them to ambush, kidnapping, and rebellion. The imperial baggage train, loaded with treasure and official documents, became a tempting target for bandits and enemy agents. The complex relationships between the emperor and the semi-autonomous themes, the military districts that formed the backbone of Byzantine administration, required constant attention and adjustment. Each theme commander was powerful enough to threaten imperial authority, but necessary enough that he couldn't be simply eliminated. The emperor had to balance the themes against each other while preventing any single commander from becoming too influential. The rebellion of Thomas the Slav in 821 to 823 AD demonstrates how quickly a theme commander could threaten the empire itself. Thomas, who controlled several themes in Asia Minor, declared himself emperor and marched on Constantinople with an army that included not only Byzantine troops but also Arab allies. Emperor Michael II was forced to endure a siege of his own capital while his empire tore itself apart in civil war. Thomas was eventually defeated and executed, but only after coming within sight of the imperial palace. The imperial intelligence networks were both indispensable and terrifying. The logothete of the dramas maintained spies throughout the empire and beyond, gathering information about potential threats and opportunities. But the spies themselves were potential threats, men who sold information to the highest bidder and whose loyalty could be purchased by anyone with sufficient gold. The emperor was forced to spy on his spies, creating layers of surveillance and counter-surveillance that could paralyze decision-making. The famous case of the plot against Emperor Leo V, the Armenian, in 820 AD illustrates the deadly complexity of imperial intelligence work. The conspiracy was discovered by imperial spies, but the emperor's attempts to root out all the plotters only created more enemies. Leo's paranoia grew so intense that he began to suspect everyone around him, including his closest advisors. On Christmas Day, 820 AD, while attending religious services in the Hagia Sophia, Leo was assassinated by conspirators who had been driven to desperation by his increasingly erratic behavior. The management of imperial succession was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of Byzantine rulership. Unlike Western European monarchies, with their relatively clear rules of primogeniture, the Byzantine Empire had no fixed succession law. The throne went to whoever could seize it and hold it, whether through military force, popular support, or political maneuvering. This meant that every emperor was simultaneously planning his own succession and defending against challenges to his authority. The co-emperor system, designed to provide stability and continuity, often created additional sources of conflict. Co-emperors were supposed to share power harmoniously, but in practice they often plotted against each other with the same intensity they brought to fighting external enemies. The senior emperor could never be sure that his junior partner wouldn't attempt to seize sole power, while the junior emperor lived in constant fear of being eliminated by his supposed ally. The relationship between Emperor Basil I and his Leo VI provides a perfect example of how family ties could become deadly liabilities. Leo was officially Basil's son, but rumors suggested that his real father was the previous emperor, Michael III, whom Basil had murdered. Basil reportedly spent years trying to decide whether to eliminate Leo or designate him as heir, while Leo lived in terror that any wrong word or gesture could trigger his father's murderous paranoia. The economic foundations of imperial power were constantly under threat from debasement, inflation, and the enormous costs of maintaining the military and bureaucracy. An emperor who couldn't pay his soldiers faced immediate rebellion, but an emperor who raised taxes too high faced popular revolt. The delicate balance between revenue and expenditure required financial skills that few emperors possessed, and economic mistakes could be literally fatal. The reign of Emperor Michael VII Darcus demonstrates how economic incompetence could destroy a dynasty. Michael's decision to debase the currency and his failure to manage the empire's grain supply led to famine, inflation, and widespread rebellion. He was overthrown in 1078 AD by Nicephorus III Britanniates, who promised to restore economic stability but instead created new problems through his own financial mismanagement. The imperial coronation regalia itself tells the story of Byzantine imperial danger. The crown was so heavy that it could cause neck injuries if worn for extended periods. The ceremonial robes were so elaborate that they restricted movement and made escape impossible in case of attack. The jeweled ornaments that adorned the emperor's person were worth more than entire cities, making him a walking treasure trove that attracted thieves, kidnappers, and assassins. The purple buskins, the ceremonial boots worn only by emperors, were said to be so uncomfortable that they caused permanent foot deformities. But removing them in public was considered such a breach of protocol that it could be interpreted as abdication. Emperors were literally trapped in their own magnificence, unable to move freely or comfortably, but required to maintain the appearance of divine authority at all times. The imperial seals and signatures were constantly under threat from forgery and theft. An emperor's seal could authorize the movement of armies, the transfer of vast sums of money, or the execution of enemies. The theft of an imperial seal was considered treason, punishable by the most horrible death imaginable, but the rewards for successful forgery were so enormous that attempts were constantly being made. Emperor Justinian II, known as the Slit-Nosed after his first deposition and mutilation, learned the hard way that even imperial seals could be turned against their owners. During his exile, his enemies used forged imperial documents to legitimize their rule and to order the execution of his supporters. When Justinian returned to power in 705 AD, he spent years trying to determine which documents were authentic and which were forgeries, a task that proved nearly impossible. The religious calendar created additional vulnerabilities for Byzantine emperors. Major Christian holidays required the emperor to appear in public, attend lengthy religious services, and participate in elaborate processions through Constantinople. These occasions provided perfect opportunities for assassination, as the emperor's movements were predictable and the crowds provided cover for attackers. The Epiphany ceremony, during which the emperor blessed the waters of the Bosphorus, was particularly dangerous because it required him to appear on a balcony overlooking the harbor, exposed to attack from land or sea. The ceremony couldn't be cancelled without suggesting that the emperor was either ill or afraid, but participating in it meant accepting enormous risk for the sake of maintaining religious traditions. The practice of imperial adoption created Byzantine families that were even more dysfunctional than biological dynasties. Adopted heirs had no blood loyalty to their imperial fathers, while biological children often resented being passed over in favor of outsiders. The result was imperial households where everyone was related by law but no one could be trusted not to commit murder for political advantage. Emperor John I, Simisks, learned this lesson when he was adopted by his predecessor, Nicephorus II, whom he then murdered in 969 AD. John's adoption was supposed to provide stability and continuity, but instead it gave him the access and opportunity needed to assassinate his adoptive father. The irony was lost on no one. The emperor had literally invited his own killer into the imperial family. The imperial bodyguards presented a paradox that no emperor could solve. The Varangian Guard, composed of foreign warriors with no local political connections, were theoretically the most trustworthy protectors an emperor could have, but their foreign origin made them unreliable in complex political situations, and Their loyalty was ultimately mercenary rather than personal. The Scalae Palatini, drawn from the Byzantine aristocracy, understood the political landscape, but were themselves part of the web of competing interests that threatened imperial authority. The attempted assassination of Emperor Leo V in 800 demonstrates the impossibility of achieving perfect security even with multiple layers of protection. The attack took place during Christmas Mass in the Hagia Sophia, supposedly one of the most secure locations in the empire. The conspirators were able to approach the emperor by disguising themselves as monks and hiding weapons under their religious robes. Even in God's house, surrounded by guards and worshippers, death stalked the purple-clad figure on the imperial throne. The imperial tombs in the Church of the Holy Apostles tell their own story of danger and violence. Many emperors never made it to their intended burial places, their bodies lost on battlefields, destroyed by enemies, or hidden by supporters who feared desecration. The empty tombs of murdered emperors served as silent testimony to the price of wearing the crown. The tomb of Emperor Nikephoros Phocas was repeatedly vandalized by enemies who blamed him for military defeats and religious persecution. His body was eventually moved to a secret location to prevent further desecration, but the location was lost during the chaos of the Fourth Crusade. The emperor who had once commanded armies and ruled an empire disappeared into historical obscurity. His final resting place unknown, and UNMOURNED. The Imperial Menagerie, maintained for the entertainment of the court and the intimidation of foreign visitors, included lions, bears, and other dangerous animals that sometimes provided convenient methods of execution. Enemies could be thrown to the beasts while maintaining the fiction that their deaths were accidental rather than judicial. The animals themselves were unpredictable dangers that could turn on their handlers or escape into the palace proper. The famous incident of Emperor Theophilos and the lion demonstrates how even imperial entertainment could become deadly. During a reception for Arab ambassadors in 842 AD, one of the imperial lions broke free from its handlers and attacked a courtier. The emperor's attempts to control the situation only made it worse, and the diplomatic reception turned into a bloodbath that damaged Byzantine prestige throughout the medieval world. The seasonal ceremonies that marked the Byzantine religious calendar required the emperor to expose himself to public view repeatedly throughout the year. The Feast of Orthodoxy, Palm Sunday processions, Easter celebrations, and numerous saints' days all demanded imperial participation. Each event was an opportunity for assassination, riot, or public humiliation that could destroy an emperor's authority. The Feast of Fools, a semi-pagan celebration that survived in Christian Byzantium, was particularly dangerous because it involved ritual mockery of authority figures, including the emperor himself. While the mockery was supposed to be temporary and symbolic, it could easily escalate into genuine rebellion if the emperor's enemies chose to exploit the occasion. The imperial wardrobe was itself a source of vulnerability. The elaborate costumes required 4 different ceremonies had to be stored, maintained, and transported by armies of servants, any of whom could be bribed or coerced into sabotage. Poison could be applied to clothing, jewelry could be trapped, and even the imperial underwear could conceal weapons intended for self-defense or suicide. The death of Emperor John VIII Palaiologos in 1448 was officially attributed to natural causes, but contemporary sources suggest that he may have been poisoned through his clothing. The emperor had been suffering from a mysterious illness that caused skin lesions and internal bleeding. symptoms consistent with certain contact poisons used by Byzantine assassins. The Imperial Library, one of the greatest repositories of knowledge in the medieval world, was both a treasure and a trap. The thousands of manuscripts contained not only classical literature and religious texts, but also detailed records of palace conspiracies, military secrets, and diplomatic correspondence that could destroy reputations or trigger wars. Librarians and scholars who had access to these documents possessed information that made them valuable to foreign powers and dangerous to the current regime. The burning of libraries during periods of civil unrest was not just cultural vandalism, but strategic warfare. When rebels seized portions of the palace, they often targeted the archives first, seeking to destroy evidence of their own past crimes while uncovering embarrassing secrets about their enemies. The emperor's personal correspondence, stored in the library's most secure sections, contained confessions, plans, and observations that could be weaponized by anyone clever enough to understand their implications. Emperor Constantine VII's literary works, including his detailed treatises on imperial administration and foreign policy, were simultaneously masterpieces of medieval scholarship and potential security disasters. His Book of Ceremonies contained precise descriptions of palace layouts, guard rotations, and security procedures that would have been invaluable to assassins. The emperor's scholarly instincts conflicted with his survival needs, creating documents that were too dangerous to publish but too valuable to destroy. The Imperial Mint presented unique security challenges because it was simultaneously a source of imperial wealth and a potential tool for rebellion. The workers who produced coins had intimate knowledge of the empire's financial condition, information that could trigger bank runs or currency speculation if it fell into the wrong hands. The dies used to strike coins could be stolen and used to produce counterfeit currency, while the precious metals stored in the mint represented enough wealth to finance entire armies. The revolt of Artabasdos in 741 to 742 AD demonstrates how control of the mint could be weaponized against the legitimate emperor. Artabasdos, who had married into the imperial family, used his position to gain access to the mint and began producing coins bearing his own image and titles. This seemingly symbolic act was actually a declaration of war, as it demonstrated his ability to finance rebellion and his intention to replace the legitimate emperor, Constantine V. The imperial kitchens employed hundreds of workers whose loyalty was constantly tested by bribes, threats, and ideological appeals from the emperor's enemies. Every meal was a potential assassination attempt, every cook a possible conspirator, every ingredient a suspected poison. The elaborate precautions taken to secure the emperor's food, multiple tasters, sealed containers, armed guards, created a dining experience that resembled a military operation more than a royal banquet. The famous poisoning attempt against Emperor Basil II in 976 AD illustrates the sophistication of palace food security. The poison was reportedly concealed in a communion wafer during a religious service, a method that would have avoided the normal food tasting protocols. Only the emperor's personal suspicion of the priest administering communion saved his life. He refused to take the wafer and later had it tested on a condemned criminal who died within hours. The seasonal migrations of the imperial court to escape the summer heat of Constantinople created mobile targets that were extremely difficult to defend. The emperor's baggage train stretched for miles, loaded with treasure, documents, and ceremonial objects that represented the accumulated wealth of centuries. Bandits, enemy agents, and rebellious generals all saw these movements as opportunities to strike at the heart of imperial power. The ambush of Emperor Romanos IV's baggage train during the 1071 campaign against the Seljuk Turks demonstrates how vulnerable these imperial movements could be. Turkish raiders destroyed much of the emperor's supplies and captured important documents that revealed Byzantine military plans. The loss of the baggage train contributed to the disaster at Manzikert and ultimately led to Romanus's capture, deposition, and death. The imperial private apartments were designed to be sanctuaries, but they became prisons of paranoia, where every shadow might conceal an assassin and every servant might be a spy. The emperor's bedroom was checked nightly for hidden weapons, poisonous animals, and structural weaknesses that could be exploited by attackers. The windows were barred not just to prevent intrusion, but to prevent the emperor from being shot by archers positioned in nearby buildings. The toilet facilities deserves particular mention because they represented a moment of extreme vulnerability that occurred multiple times daily. The imperial guardrobe was surrounded by guards and checked regularly for concealed weapons or enemies. But the emperor's need for privacy created opportunities that assassins could exploit. The famous murder of Emperor Constans II in 668 AD reportedly took place in a bathhouse, where the emperor was struck down with a soap dish while he was unable to defend himself. The imperial seraglio, when it existed, was a hotbed of intrigue that could destroy emperors as easily as it could please them. The competition among concubines for imperial favor created networks of alliance and betrayal that extended throughout the palace. Women who had borne imperial children became political players in their own right, capable of organizing conspiracies that could topple dynasties. The case of Anna Dalasina, mother of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, demonstrates how imperial women could wield power that rivaled that of the emperor himself. Anna effectively ruled the empire during her son's military campaigns, making decisions about taxation, appointments, and foreign policy that bound the emperor to courses of action he might not have chosen himself. Her influence was so great that Alexius's enemies targeted her for assassination, forcing the emperor to choose between his mother's safety and his own political needs. The imperial physicians faced an impossible dilemma. They needed intimate knowledge of the emperor's health to treat him effectively. But this knowledge made them dangerous to the regime and valuable to its enemies. A physician who knew that the emperor was dying could sell this information to potential successors, while a physician who knew about the emperor's mental condition could be forced to testify about his fitness to rule. The death of Emperor John II Komnenos in 1143 AD remains controversial, partly because of questions about his medical treatment. Some historians suggest that his physicians deliberately delayed treatment of his infected wound to ensure that his preferred successor, Manuel, would inherit the throne rather than his designated heir, Isaac. The emperor's death may have been medical malpractice, but it was also political engineering of the most sophisticated kind. The imperial religious obligations created a calendar of vulnerabilities that assassins could exploit with mathematical precision. The emperor was required to attend specific services on specific days, often in public locations where security was difficult to maintain. The Palm Sunday procession, the Epiphany blessing of the waters, and the Easter vigil all required the emperor to follow predictable routes at predictable times, creating opportunities for attack that were almost impossible to eliminate. The assassination of Emperor Nicephorus, to focus on December 10, 969 AD, took place during the emperor's private evening prayers, demonstrating that even religious devotion could be turned into a vulnerability. The conspirators, led by John. WSEs used their knowledge of the emperor's religious habits to time their attack for maximum effect. Nicephorus was killed while kneeling before an icon, his blood spattering the religious images he had been contemplating. The imperial marriage. Arrangements were diplomatic and military alliances disguised as romantic relationships, but they created intimate enemies who shared the emperor's bed, his meals, and his most private moments. An imperial wife who decided that her husband was a liability to her family's interests could poison him slowly over months or years, maintaining the appearance of devotion while systematically destroying his health. The marriage of Emperor Constantine VII to Helena Lekarpnos in 919 AD demonstrates how matrimonial politics could become deadly. Helena's father, Romanos I Lycapenos, used his daughter's position to gradually usurp imperial power, eventually forcing Constantine into a subordinate role in his own empire. When Constantine finally moved against his father-in-law in 944 AD, he was forced to choose between his wife's loyalty and his own imperial authority. The imperial heir's education was designed to prepare future emperors for the realities of Byzantine politics, but it often produced psychologically damaged individuals who were unable to trust anyone or make rational decisions. Young princes were taught to see enemies everywhere, to interpret every gesture as potentially threatening, and to assume that anyone who approached them wanted something that could only be obtained through betrayal. The case of Emperor Michael VII Doukas illustrates how this paranoid education could backfire. Michael had been so thoroughly trained to suspect everyone that he became incapable of decisive action, spending his reign paralyzed by indecision while the empire crumbled around him. His enemies didn't need to assassinate him. They simply waited for his incompetence to destroy his own regime. The imperial navy, supposedly one of the emperor's most reliable assets, was actually a source of constant danger because naval commanders operated far from Constantinople and could easily declare independence or ally themselves with foreign powers. The famous rebellion of Alexios Komnenos the Younger in 1201 AD began with his seizure of the imperial fleet, which he used to raid Byzantine territories and threaten Constantinople itself. The seasonal naval campaigns created additional vulnerabilities, because they required the emperor to divide his forces and trust distant commanders with enormous responsibilities. The loss of the imperial fleet could leave Constantinople defenseless against seaborne attacks, while a rebellious naval commander could blockade the capital and starve it into submission. The imperial diplomatic correspondence was a treasure trove of secrets that could destroy reputations, trigger wars, or reveal military plans to enemies. The theft of diplomatic pouches was a constant concern, as was the possibility that imperial ambassadors might be captured and tortured for information. The emperor's personal letters to foreign rulers contained confessions, promises, and observations that could be weaponized by anyone clever enough to understand their implications. The famous interception of Emperor Michael VIII Paleo correspondence with the Pope in 1274 AD nearly triggered a civil war when Orthodox extremists learned of the emperor's plans to reunite the Eastern and Western churches. The letters revealed not just theological compromises, but also military arrangements with Western powers that could have destroyed Byzantine independence. The imperial coronation ceremony was supposed to be the most glorious moment in an emperor's life, but it was also often the most dangerous. The elaborate ritual required the emperor to remain motionless for hours while wearing a crown so heavy that it could cause neck injuries. The ceremony took place in public, surrounded by crowds whose loyalty was uncertain and whose enthusiasm could turn to violence without warning. The coronation of Emperor Michael V, Caliphates, in 1042 AD, turned into a riot when the people of Constantinople learned that he had attempted to exile the popular empress, Zoe. The ceremony was interrupted by stone-throwing mobs who invaded the Hagia Sophia and dragged the would-be emperor from the altar. Michael was blinded and castrated while still wearing his coronation robes, his imperial dreams ending in agony and humiliation. The management of imperial finances required a delicate balance between maintaining the army's loyalty and avoiding popular rebellion over excessive taxation. An emperor who couldn't pay his soldiers faced immediate military coup, but an emperor who raised taxes to faced urban riots and provincial rebellion. The financial pressures of maintaining the empire created a constant crisis that could destroy even the most competent rulers. The economic policies of Emperor Nicephorus I, who attempted to restore the empire's finances through aggressive taxation and currency reform, triggered rebellions throughout the empire and ultimately contributed to his death in battle. Against the Bulgars in 811 AD, his financial success created the military resources needed for his campaigns, but his fiscal severity made him so unpopular that his death was celebrated rather than mourned. The imperial private correspondence reveals the psychological toll of wearing the purple crown. Letters between emperors and their closest advisors are filled with expressions of paranoia, loneliness, and despair that contrast sharply with the public image of divine confidence. The emperor's private thoughts, when they survive in historical records, paint a picture of men who were simultaneously the most powerful and most miserable people in their world. Emperor Constantine VII's private letters to his son reveal a man haunted by the betrayals he had witnessed and the violence he had been forced to commit. His advice to his heir reads like a survival manual for navigating a world where everyone was a potential enemy and every decision could be fatal. The emperor, who had successfully ruled for decades, still felt like a hunted animal, constantly looking over his shoulder for the next threat. The seasonal celebrations that marked the Byzantine religious and civil calendar created a rhythm of vulnerability that enemies could exploit. The emperor was required to appear at specific festivals, follow traditional routes through the city, and participate in ceremonies that made him accessible to the public. Each celebration was simultaneously a demonstration of imperial power and an opportunity for assassination. The Festival of Brumalia, a week-long celebration that combined Christian and pagan elements, was particularly dangerous because it involved widespread public drinking and the temporary suspension of normal social hierarchies. The emperor was expected to participate in the revelries, but his appearance at public festivities made him vulnerable to attack by assassins, who could approach him while pretending to be celebrants. The imperial bodyguards faced an impossible task. They had to protect a man who was simultaneously the most valuable and most hated person in the empire. The guards themselves were potential threats, as their intimate access to the emperor made them valuable targets for bribery or coercion. The history of the Byzantine Empire is filled with stories of emperors who were murdered by their own protectors. The Varangian Guard, composed of foreign warriors who supposedly had no local political connections, were theoretically the most reliable imperial protectors, but their foreign origins made them unreliable in complex political situations, and their loyalty was ultimately mercenary rather than personal. When Emperor Nicephorus III Britanniates was overthrown in 1081 AD, his Varangian guards simply transferred their allegiance to the new emperor, Alexios I Comnene, demonstrating that even supposedly loyal foreigners could be pragmatic about their employment. The imperial regalia told the story of Byzantine power through the accumulated weight of centuries. Each piece of jewelry, each ceremonial weapon, each religious artifact represented not just wealth, but also the blood of the enemies who had been defeated to obtain it. The crown jewels were literally soaked in the history of violence that had created and maintained the empire. The famous crown of Constantine the Great, supposedly worn by the first Christian emperor, was actually a medieval creation that incorporated elements from multiple periods and sources. But its symbolic power was so great that emperors risked their lives to wear it, even though its weight and awkward balance made it a physical burden that could cause injury during long ceremonies. The final emperors of Byzantium, ruling from the shrunken territories around Constantinople as the Ottoman Empire closed in from all sides, faced dangers that were both traditional and unprecedented. The old threats of palace coups, religious disputes, and economic collapse were now combined with the existential threat of foreign conquest that made all other concerns seem trivial. Emperor Constantine Onsopali, who died defending the walls of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, faced the ultimate test of imperial courage. He could have fled the city, negotiated a surrender, or attempted to save himself through some face-saving compromise. Instead, he chose to die as an emperor, fighting for his empire even when the cause was hopeless. His body was never definitively identified among the thousands of corpses that littered the city after the Ottoman conquest. But his choice to die with his empire rather than live without it represented the final act of a 1,000-year drama. The purple had always been a beautiful curse, a magnificent trap that offered unlimited power at the price of unlimited vulnerability. For more than a millennium, men had worn the Byzantine crown, knowing that it would probably kill them, but unable to resist the intoxicating combination of authority and terror that came with imperial power. They ruled the known world while living in constant fear, commanded armies while sleeping with daggers under their pillows, and proclaimed their divine mandate while counting the days until their enemies would strike. The last emperor died as the first had lived, surrounded by enemies, betrayed by allies, and sustained only by the terrible knowledge that the purple, once assumed, could never be safely abandoned. The Byzantine Empire fell not because its emperors were weak, but because the burden of absolute power in a world of absolute enemies had finally become too great for any mortal man to bear. In the end, the most dangerous thing about being a Byzantine emperor was not the constant threat of death, but the knowledge that death, when it came, would probably be a mercy. The purple robe that had seemed so beautiful from a distance revealed itself, once worn, to be woven from the nightmares of 1,000 years of imperial terror. The crown that had appeared so glorious proved to be forged from the accumulated fears of men who had learned too late that absolute power and absolute safety were mutually exclusive concepts. The dangerous life of a Byzantine emperor was not just a historical curiosity, but a meditation on the nature of power itself, a reminder that those who would rule others must first learn to survive themselves, and that the price of the purple was always paid in blood, paranoia, and the slow destruction of the human soul. The empire that called itself eternal lasted for more than 1,000 years, but the men who ruled it rarely survived for more than a few decades. In the end, the greatest enemy of every Byzantine emperor was not foreign invasion or domestic rebellion, but the terrible weight of the crown itself, beautiful, glorious, and absolutely lethally dangerous.